Okay, I hope you can see also subtitles. Okay, so let's start. Dear participants of research platform Disability Studies in Eastern Europe, Reconfigurations. We are glad to see you at our next invitation, our next seminar, our next lecture, and it's also our last meeting in this year. We are really glad to see you. And I would like to introduce you our visitors. Our visitors are Radu Harald Dinu, who is a senior lecturer in history at the School of Education and Communication at Jönköping University in Sweden. His research is focused on modern and contemporary history of Eastern Europe and covers a wide range of themes from the history of fascism to how communism shaped experiences of disability in Eastern Europe. I would like also to introduce you Staffan Bengtsson, who is Assistant Professor of Social Work and an Associate Professor of Disability Research at the School of Health and Welfare, also at Jönköping University in Sweden. At the center of his ongoing research stands disability as a societal phenomenon in relation to various theoretical perspectives in models. And I would like to introduce you into the newest book, Disability and Labor in the 20th Century, Historical and Comparative Perspectives. And maybe I will give the voice to you. Feel free to present your book and your perspective.
Thank you, Alicia.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for inviting us. I would like to share our PowerPoint. If somebody can make me co-host, I could do that. And our plan is to share the talking time. So Staffan will start to say some words, and then I will continue, and then Staffan will continue and talk. And I think the whole talk will take around 50 minutes or something, 45, 50 minutes.
Okay.
3 or 4 hours, Radu, not longer.
Yeah, or 3 or 4 hours, exactly.
Okay.
So now I can share the screen.
Yes. I allowed you to do it.
Yeah. So now
okay, so now I will close my camera and I'm giving the time to you.
Okay, Staffan, do you want to start?
Okay, well, I also would like to say thanks for having us. Thank you for the invitation. Many new acquaintances here today. Okay, thank you also for the nice introduction. And I don't think we have to introduce ourselves any further than that. Okay, the objective of this session, our presentation, is to take a little bit of your time and talk about our upcoming anthology, Disability and Labor in the 20th Century, Historical and Comparative Perspectives. So we will give some, as Radu said, some sort of overall introduction about the book and its themes, and talk a little bit about our own chapters and contributions, studies in this book. Besides the presentation, hopefully we will have also some time for questions and discussions to hear your thoughts about these issues and the content of the anthology. This anthology is the outcome of an international workshop that was held, was it a year ago, Radu? I don't remember. Something.
That's true.
Yeah.
1.5 years ago.
Yeah. And first the participants were invited and supposed to gather in Jönköping, but due to the pandemic, the workshop had to be in a digital form, but I think it worked pretty well. Okay, the reason for writing a book about disability and work from an historical perspective is that disability and work raises many questions and offers major challenges in our own time. As you all know, if we look at, for instance, unemployment rates, they are much higher when it comes to people with disabilities, even though the statistics looks different depending on which group we are talking about. But generally, it can be much harder to find a job and to keep a job if you have a disability, which in turn relates to things like accessibility, participation, assistive technology, discrimination issues, and so on. So at the same time, work and occupation are considered to be crucial phenomenon in our time. And work and disability gain access to the labor market, etc., is present in both international and national conventions and policies, in Sweden, for instance. So the meaning of work also contains several layers. First, we have the material dimension, of course, that work is ultimately about gaining economic means in order to survive, handle everyday living. But work also is about maintaining health, for instance, so it relates to well-being of the individual. And work is also about self-identity and social identity. So our occupation is also about representation of ourselves. So it has to do with social status. And another aspect of work is that it makes it even more interesting to analyze from an historical point of view, is that it also contains more sociological factors. Since work also is used to pursue work ethics and to control and to discipline citizens and to create and shape the ideal citizen. Another reason for writing this anthology is that there's only a limited amount of research on disability and work in history. And this is rather remarkable, considering that this is a field that raises many interesting questions in relation to history. What has work meant for the shaping of our identities, the struggle for empowerment, and so on, and also the role of work ethics in different times, and how various production systems influence how the body is understood. So the transition from a farming society, for instance, to an industrial one, characterized by information and services. So many chapters and contributions in this anthology addresses to some extent these kind of questions, even though we don't have the ambition to answer all of them in this anthology. Radu, should you say something more about the overall content of the anthology?
Yes, thank you. As Staffan already mentioned, we were supposed to meet in Jönköping in 2021 because we got a research initiation grant by a Swedish foundation, which is called Riksbankens Jubileumsfond. But this was in the middle of the pandemic, so nobody could travel to Jönköping. So we had this workshop online, so we couldn't use the money, unfortunately. But fortunately, we completed this volume, and yeah, that's the result of this symposium we had. And I thought that I could give you a short overview over the chapters, but before doing that, also a short background from me, because both me and Staffan, when we started to plan this symposium, we realized that many studies in our field are limited to national perspectives, mostly from the Western world, while comparative perspectives or transnational approaches are lacking. And one consequence of this imbalance is that paradigms which were developed in the English-speaking world, most of you are familiar with the social model, the medical model in disability research, for example, that these paradigms cannot be translated frictionless to other societies. For example, state socialism, societies that experience other historical trajectories. So that was our basic idea, to transcend these geographical limitations and work transnationally and make comparisons. And of course, we cannot examine the whole world. So we started with our own expertise, which is Sweden, Western Europe, and Eastern Europe. And we focused on the second half of the 20th century, even if some chapters also tackle the interwar period, for example. So let me quickly present the various chapters, and I will jump over the introduction and Staffan's chapter and my own chapter, because we will present them in more detail soon. And I'm also happy that some of the chapter authors are here with us today, Kristina Popescu and Ina Dimitrova and Marcin Stasiak. So we won't be able to talk about all chapters, but if you have more specific questions, then yeah, it's great that they are with us, so they could answer. But let's quickly look at these at the chapters in the volume. So the first chapter, as you see, is written by Dustin Gaylor, and he's a historian associated with the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy in Toronto. And in his contribution, he highlights how the issue of poverty and accessibility to the labor market have been negotiated between the disability rights movement in Canada and government agencies since the 1960s. The second chapter is written by Ylva Söderfeld, and she's head of the Center of Medical Humanities in Uppsala University. And her chapter highlights how women with multiple sclerosis were expected to comply with gender roles that were articulated in periodicals, and these periodicals were published by MS patient organizations in Germany and Sweden. So it's also a comparative chapter. Anna Derksen has written the third chapter, which is also comparative, and she has looked at how labor market issues were discussed by disability rights organizations in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And she's also a historian affiliated to both the University of Leiden in the Netherlands and Greifswald in Germany. Chapter 5 is written by Kristina Popescu. She's a researcher at the University of Bielefeld in Germany, but she's also affiliated to the EHESS in Paris. And her contribution focuses on the so-called Fifth French Republic, so the period after 1958, and how discourses on disability were related to labor market issues in France. Frances Bernstein from Drew University in the US has written the sixth chapter, which examines the rehabilitation of wounded veterans in the Soviet Union during late Stalinism. Chapter 7, written by Ina Dimitrova from the University of Plovdiv in Bulgaria. She has reconstructed how psychiatrists in socialist Bulgaria forged an alliance with their patients and challenged official notions and definitions of workability. Then we have chapter 8, written by Christina Diak, also a historian at the National Institute for the Study of Totalitarianism in Bucharest, which is a part of the Romanian Academy of Science. And she examines how the social security legislation in state socialist Romania framed disabled people and disability allowances. Victoria Schmidt is the author of the 10th chapter, and she's working at the University of Graz in Austria. And her contribution examines the many downsides of vocational training for disabled people in socialist Czechoslovakia. The final case study is about people who have had polio and how their working life could look like in socialist Poland. And the chapter is written by Marcin Stasiak at the University of Krakow. I'm sure he can say more about his chapter later when we have a discussion. And then we also have Monica Barr, who talked around 2 weeks ago. She's a professor of history at the European University Institute in Florence and has written afterward to this volume where she provides a synthesis and discusses some common themes that run through our volume. So let me now present some general observations we have made in our introductory chapter and when working with this volume. And one of the many insights was that experiences of disability and workability have followed similar trajectories in the East and the West, even though the welfare systems were legitimized on different ideological grounds, of course. And a key aspect is that marginalization and integration were two sides of the same coin. So on the one hand, in many of the countries we have examined, people with disabilities were excluded from mainstream labor, unsurprisingly. But on the other hand, I think somebody has to mute their microphone because it's still on, but I can't do it myself. Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. So on the other hand, there's a plethora of examples showing that labor was also used as a means of integration, and in some cases even emancipation for disabled people. Rehabilitating disabled people through mainstream labor or through sheltered work aimed both to normalize them, but also to secure important workforce during the economic expansion after the Second World War. Moreover, differences between Eastern European countries, for example, were greater than between Eastern and West, the Eastern and the Western Bloc. Because, for example, the idea of the healthy, able-bodied and productive citizen was strikingly similar when comparing these different countries. Even the urban-rural divide or segregated spaces for disabled people, for example, sheltered workshops, existed in both capitalist and socialist systems. And we argue, therefore, that similarities trump national or ideological frames of reference. So when it comes to disability and work during this period, we did not find any national exceptionalism or Sonderweg, as German historians would say. When looking at the disability rights movement, for example, there are also some parallels between East and West, because in Eastern Europe, advocacy groups, especially for the deaf and the blind, which were the two big, advocacy groups or associations, could of course not raise their voices as compared to the West, to Western Europe or North America. I think Monica Barr articulated that and remarked on that last 2 weeks ago when she held her talk, that activists, they of course didn't chain their wheelchairs to buses as it happened in Western societies. However, disabled people in Eastern Europe found other forms of resistance and way to circumvent or bypass the system, as Marcin Stasiak, for example, showed in his chapter. So let me continue with some general remarks on labor as a social phenomenon. There's a famous quote by the German Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt. She noted in one of her books from 1950s, The Human Condition, that the modern age has developed a theoretical glorification of labor, transforming the whole society into a laboring society. And her assessment from the 1950s seems to be relevant today as well, because work is still seen as something positive, desirable, both politically for becoming a full-fledged citizen, but also for the individual's identity formation, because participation in labor promotes social recognition. From a disability perspective, or disability studies perspective, labor is linked to work ability. And this idea has been crucial in all the countries, of course, we have examined in our volume. However, the notion of work ability is ambiguous and has had shifting meanings. For example, when experts, medical experts, were to assess and measure the work ability of disabled people, and still do. As an example, work ability can easily become a proxy for human value, because it entails the risk of stigmatizing those who do not economically contribute to society. Let me also point to some themes in previous research on labor and disability. We have seen that labor history, the field of labor history, has broadened the field in recent decades, maybe since the 1970s, and started to pay attention to informal forms of labor, for example, unfree labor, domestic labor, or other forms of precarious working arrangements. But disability is still neglected by labor historians. And there's also a lack of comparative perspectives that address the question of how the emergence of wage labor and other forms of informal labor have affected disabled people during the 20th century. Of course, you can find a lot of fragmentary arguments on labor and disability in seminal works from disability history, but empirical studies are lacking. Henri-Jacques Sticker, for example, interpreted sheltered workshops as an ambiguous place where segregation and exclusion became the reverse side of integration and normalization in Western societies. And then we also have the British proponents of the social model of disability, and they also provided a framework that argued from a distinct Western materialist point of view. Mike Oliver, for example, claimed that capitalism marginalized disabled people on the grounds that their labor was viewed as less productive. And this approach was later termed as the industrialization thesis. It has inspired many, but there's a lack of empirical studies that confirm this hypothesis. And for example, David Turner and Daniel Blackie have questioned this interpretation, this industrialization thesis, and demonstrated that disabled people were present in various sides of industrial development during the 19th century. And they showed that capitalist industrialization was not exclusively a story of marginalization for disabled people. Western histories of disability can also be challenged by shedding light on socialist societies, as we have done in our volume, because many tenets that were previously ascribed to Western societies can be equally found in state socialism. For example, the control of labor through Taylorist models of scientific management or productivism. Another observation is that the Anglo-Saxon framework in which charities have traditionally played a central role does not apply to the particularities, for example, in Scandinavian countries, or to social democratic welfare regimes as described by Gösta Esping Andersen. So these are some themes which we are discussing in our introductory chapter, and now Staffan will talk about his chapter, a case study on Sweden.
Could I have the next slide, please, Radu?
Here.
Before I continue to my own chapter, we should say perhaps something about a theoretical framework, even though we're not supposed to go into these issues too deep here today. But one way of approaching these issues, which to some extent is also present in the different chapters and studies in the anthology, is to consider and to analyze the relation and tension between normality and deviance, of course, but also about ideas about what is normal and the ideal in a certain time and context, and what is understood as form of deviance from that norm. And subsequently, these ideas it's also about including inclusion and exclusion practices in various ways. So this could be a very overall fruitful analytical model, also when conducting comparative studies in relation to disability, history and work. And the next slide, Radu. As Radu has already mentioned, this is also interesting to approach from the medical model and the social model. I don't think we have to go too much deep into these different models, but the medical model, of course, is about some kind of ideal image of how the body should look like and function, which also means that disability becomes a question for medical experts or other experts who assess and diagnose the body in order to, if possible, change the body in line with its normative and cultural ideas. And this was a model that was, of course, challenged by the social model. that shift from body to society in many ways. So disability is more of a result of a society that is not adapted to diversity and different conditions, but and focuses on barriers and obstacles. Now, both these models and the tension between them are something that can be fruitful to use when conducting also historical research. At the same time, there's always a risk of ending up in anachronistic analyses and conclusions when modern concepts are transported back into history. So they are interesting models, but they should be used with caution. Perhaps we could come back to that. Could I have the next slide, Radu? If I shall move on to my own contribution in this anthology, my chapter is called For Society and Individual, Disability and Work in Post-War Sweden. And the next slide. And this chapter it's based on a report that presented by the Committee for the so-called partially able to work. And this was this committee is the first of its kind in Sweden to focus entirely on disability and the labor market. We have examples of earlier investigations, but they also touched the work issues, but more as part of other issues, such as education for the disabled during the 19th century, for example. And this was a committee that was broadly composed and was appointed on behalf of the Social Democratic government in 1943. And the overall question guiding my chapter is, how did the committee reason when it came to disability and work? And how was work and work problems framed in relation to the context? And speaking about the context, could I have the next slide, Radu? It's also interesting to study the committee's work in relation to a Swedish context that was divided, and actually, as I see it, contains two different tracks in relation to disability. And one track was categorized by control, repressive measures, where disability and the deviant body was seen as a kind of threat to society. Expressed through practices linked to, for example, eugenics, sterilizations of people with disabilities in Sweden. And the second track was categorized by an ambition to create various support systems that was linked to disability. And here people with disabilities also came to be covered by the general construction of a modern welfare state, with access to, for example, pensions and various allowances, education, and so on. So the committee finds itself in this, in the middle of this contradictory context with different logics and opposite goals, as I see it. And the next slide, Radu. So in my chapter, I highlight a number of themes in relation to the committee's work. So what I'm trying to do in this chapter is to summarize some of these reasoning. That includes both a description of reality regarding disability and the labor market in terms of a social problem, but also how these descriptions and reasoning in itself says something about the values and norms that surrounded people with disabilities at this time. And the first theme deals with disability as part of an overarching socio-cultural values in connection to a well-established work ethics in the Swedish society. And this is one quote from this report, that the citizens, each according to their ability, should participate in the productive work and thereby support themselves and their families is obvious. However, their ability to work varies. As the quote shows, people with disabilities were also expected to become part of a society's production, and people with disabilities were expected to fulfill the ideal of the productive citizen. In other words, as many as possible should be embraced by the principles of the Protestant work ethic. So in that sense, the committee saw the working body as an important means to also create the strong nation. So the passive member of society was seen as a kind of threat. At the same time, the committee emphasized that the conditions of the body must be highlighted in the narrative of the active citizen. So here too, we see expressions of different logics in relation to disability. The next slide, please. Another theme that I highlight in my chapter deals with the committee's way of placing disability and body in relation to a more rational society, more modern, if one wants. And here's another interesting quote in relation to this. In a rationally organized society, not only those who are fully able to work, but also those who are partially able to work should participate in production. The achievement of this goal is, of course, associated with difficulties, but society's own interest in this should, in most cases, coincide with that of individuals. It seems to be possible to assume that the majority of the partially able to work suffer from the forced unemployment in which they often must live. Furthermore, regarding future population development, it should be important that society focuses on seeking to create conditions for a better utilization of the available labor force. Investigations thus carried out show that the number of individuals in the most productive working ages will fall considerably over the next 20 years. At the same time as a considerable increase in the older, less able-bodied or completely incapacitated can be expected to occur. So it wasn't just about changing the individual and the body, as you can see in this quote. It was also about organizing society in a more rational way to ensure that more people could be transformed into these active citizens. The increased rationality was something that was considered to be in the interest of both the individual and society, and a stronger society equated to happier individuals, according to this reasoning. So not having the status of an active citizen in the labor market was considered to create unhappy people. So both society and individual must be considered. So this is a very important message, overall message in this report. The society and the individual. Next slide, please, Radu. Another theme highlighted in this chapter is disability and the economic system. Sweden was part of the Western capitalistic order after the World War II, even though it also represented a political system that underlined a very strong interventionist state. For the committee, the capitalistic system could be a challenge and a problem with when it comes to people with disabilities. Another quote, during economic crisis which create unemployment, in the first place, older or physically otherwise incomplete people are excluded from production. Once they have been knocked out, they have a hard time winning re-employment and being refitted at all in any place in production. Therefore, during an economic upswing, a certain amount of residual unemployment persists from the recessions. Studies have shown that the majority of unemployed are not considered fully fit for work and therefore cannot be placed in the open labor market. In addition, there are still a very large number of citizens who, due to various blemishes or diseases, are semi-invalid, and an even larger number who, although they have lost only part of their ability to work, are not prepared for work and are therefore referred to live mainly on individual or state pensions. So the committee believed that the recurring crisis in the capitalist system could pose difficult challenges for people with disabilities, where they risk ending up in what I call a frozen category. So once you have fallen outside, it's difficult to get back into the system. You become a deviant and a passive citizen in the eyes of others. So certain groups becomes more vulnerable in a modern capitalistic order. Disability and the body were interpreted based on this competition on the open labor market. At the same time, it's not given that the impairment should result in disability. It also depended on how the system itself changed, which is very interesting, I think. Also, the capitalist system could also be seen as an opportunity in this report, where people with disabilities, for instance, could start their own company, for instance. Okay, then the next one, Radu. And this is about the target group that was not given in this report, the work of the committee. For instance, work ability could differ. But it's also interesting. Is the fact that the committee very much understood individuals' ability to work and the conditions for work in relation to how society and other actors valued and assessed people with disabilities. So the committee chose to divide the partially able body into different subcategories. One of the reasons for this is that there were different problems linked to different types of disability. A subcategory, for instance, was the blind. An obstacle for these to establish themselves on the labor market were older beliefs that this was a group especially adapted for older and simpler forms of handicraft. These were notions that were difficult to reconcile with the emergence of a modern society. A problem linked to different types of disability was employers' too high demands and the negative attitudes and expectations when it came to productivity and physical ability. Okay, the next one, Radu. The committee was not only concerned with describing reality, they also had ideas, of course, about what kind of changes they wanted to see and recommendations. If you look at it on an overall level, they asked for a more active state to create clearer support structures. This was also a consequence of the World War, where, for example, injured soldiers required an extended rehabilitation system and support. And not least, the United States was seen as a role model in this case. It was also about working against negative attitudes on the part of the employer. And another thing that the committee highlighted was the need to focus on individual strengths rather than the weaknesses and shortcomings. So in addition, the committee wanted the employment service to work in different ways when it came to matching conditions, premises with suitable positions for the disabled, and increased collaboration, another thing that the committee wanted to see. And what they also wanted to avoid different special solutions, which is interesting. The establishment on the labor market should be solved within the framework of regular organizations and a connection to the real labor market. With some exceptions. In first, and when it came to people with mental disabilities who were considered to need more of special solutions. And the final slide there, Radu. Some overall conclusions in relation to my contribution. The committee work illuminates in many ways the increased awareness that the body and disability must be understood based on production system, disability part of overarching social cultural values. The capitalism was seen both as an asset and a barrier, and it touches, to some extent at least, the framework of the social model. And a functional labor market requires the involvement of people with disabilities. Okay, Radu, should we move on to Romania?
Yes, let's do that. So we move on to Southeastern Europe, which is my case study, in which I have explored the ways in which blind people were to be integrated into the workforce in socialist Romania. And the source material I've used was partly archival documents from the Romanian National Archives, especially a collection that, as far as I know, has not been used by historians so far. And this, the collection is called the Union of Work Cooperatives, UCECOM in Romanian, which was the main employer for disabled people during that period. And in addition, I have also used the Blind Association's own journals that were published in both Braille, but also in standard print from, I think, from the late 60s. As in many other countries, labor opportunities for disabled people were also in Romania traditionally focused on crafts, as can be seen in these photos from 1929. And one of the questions, therefore, was how the communist takeover in 1947 and the ideological paradigm shift that transformed Romania from a monarchy to a one-party state affected people with disabilities. So in 1947, when the Communist Party came to power, companies, foundations, and other types of associations were expropriated and nationalized, which of course also affected sheltered workshops that became controlled by the state. The Ministry of Labor also founded new national associations for the deaf and the blind in 1953 and 1955, respectively, and they were modeled after the Soviet sister organizations for the blind and the deaf. And as far as labor was concerned, the blind people were now to be placed in various sheltered workshops that were organized as cooperatives, worker cooperatives. And at the beginning of this period, in the late 1940s, 1950s, this system was still undeveloped, and people with various types of disabilities, but also war veterans, war widows, were simply lumped together in the same facility. The Ministry of Labor even tried to institutionalize other groups in societies, for example, juvenile delinquents, beggars, prostitutes, and disabled people, who were all considered to be victims of the former bourgeois or capitalist system. And unsurprisingly, these facilities at the beginning of the period were called Centers for Productive Re-Education, because their aim was to curtail social deviance, to keep disabled people off the streets, or in other words, to civilize these groups and to discipline these marginalized groups. At the same time, some facilities were from the outset reserved for disabled people, such as in Bucharest, which where we have the first cooperative for the blind, and which also remained the main employer for blind people until 1989 and even later, as vocational training also was conducted there. And as this quote you see here from the Ministry of Labor demonstrates, sheltered workplaces had apparently ideological underpinnings. So as this report I found stated, the aim of the worker cooperative for the blind in Bucharest was to endow the blind, who until recently have been forsaken by bourgeois governments, with a socialist production unit, and to enable them to leave behind the disgraceful practice of begging that they were forced to resort to. The labor of the blind cooperative gives them the opportunity to earn their livelihood in a righteous and honest way. It helps them to regain confidence in their own potential and renders them useful to socialist society, end of quote. And in this context, productivism became the main principle that structured working life under state socialism, of course, not only in sheltered workplaces. And many of the models that had already been implemented in the Soviet Union since the 1930s were now applied to the Romanian context. Amongst other things, disabled workers in cooperatives were to be paid a fixed piece rate, while the organization of labor implemented, for example, Taylorist principles of production and scientific management. And another dimension that reflected this productivist ethos was to mobilize workers by means of socialist emulation. Most of you, I guess, are familiar with the Staffanovid movement, which was also important to Romania after World War II, but was abandoned after Stalin's death in the late 50s in Romania. But even later, during the 1960s and 70s, socialist emulation campaigns remained a vital feature in both mainstream industries and in cooperatives for disabled people. And this is, and therefore it is, of course, unsurprising that the cooperative for the blind in Bucharest, for example, experienced the same struggle over the means of raising output. So in 1968, for example, readers of the journal published by the Blind Association could read that, quote, blind workers in the broom making section of the cooperative in the town of Giurgiu have surpassed the production plan for the most recent quarter by 214%. So these publications were full with statements like these. And mobilizing workers to surpass production quotas was also prompted by the nationwide competitions that gave winners material benefits, such as, for example, vouchers for health resorts, but above all, they raised their social prestige. Both individuals' social prestige, but also production units' social prestige. And cooperatives that had surpassed their production quota were, for example, also awarded the transferable banner, which was an award in socialist emulation contexts, also originating in the Soviet Union. And yeah, needless to say, all these measures were to contribute to the bold economic goals of the Communist Party to industrialize the country. So the head of the Workers' Cooperative for the Blind in Bucharest, for example, put it as follows, which is the quotation on the left-hand side. Our collective is determined to face any obstacle. Together with all working people in our homeland, it will make its modest contribution to fulfill the 5-year plan for 1971 to 75 ahead of schedule and persistently work to satisfy the obligations that are demanded of us by the important programmatic documents adopted at the 11th Congress of the Romanian Communist Party. The sentence is as long in Romanian as it is in English. And of course, as a historian, one must take these official statements with a large pinch of salt, because if we look behind the scenes and based on the archival material I have studied, I found a lot of evidence. There was, of course, a lot of discontent and complaints by the blind community that testify to the shortcomings, of course, disabled people had to face in their everyday lives. And I want to quote one letter of complaint which I found by accident, and the letter is written in 1957 by the chairman of the Blind Association. His name was Ion Tănăsescu. And this letter was addressed to the Speaker of the Parliament at that time, Constantin Pârvulescu, in which the Blind Association openly criticized all the promises that had not been fulfilled by the socialist welfare state. And amongst others, Tănăsescu estimated that only 700 out of 13,000 blind people in Romania had a paid employment, and that many vocational schools, for example, had insufficient capacities. And another complaint was that the blind were still prevented from accessing more skilled professions, because the few vocational schools that existed only prepared pupils for traditional trades, such as brush making or rope making. And he concluded his letter, which is the quotation on the right-hand side, that neither the practice of old classical professions nor the cooperatives' low productivity can secure workplaces for the blind today, thus making it impossible for the blind to earn their livelihood with honesty and dignity intact. End of quotation. So this was the 1950s, and at that time, of course, the term activist was not used, but Ion Tănăsescu, who wrote this letter, was retrospectively described as a true militant for the rights of the blind. And this also explains why he was dismissed by the Ministry of Labor only some few months later after he wrote this letter. So let me conclude or present the conclusions of my chapter. So on the one hand, many blind people, I could really see that in the publications of the Blind Association, for example. Blind people embraced, at least officially, the socialist imaginary and strove to overcome their disability through labor. Yeah, and they did it by contributing with labor to build socialism, and the blind could hope for being recognized as fully fledged citizens by contributing with their labor. And this is also why, this is my main argument, why labor became the most important setting where blind people could articulate their hopes of equality, recognition, and socialism. However, these utopian visions rested on a problematic premise, since equality was strictly conditional on each one's contribution to the labor force. And as a consequence, only labor guaranteed political recognition, which of course excluded a large number of disabled people. And we don't have exact numbers, but we know that many blind people, especially in rural areas, remained outside the state-sanctioned workers' cooperative system during the socialist period. And additionally, many of the Communist Party's high goals of maximizing productivity were never achieved, as these workers' cooperatives were constantly plagued by, for example, material shortages, and ultimately remained unproductive. So the conclusion is that the Communist Party's promise of providing welfare for all ultimately fell short of its own expectations. So yeah, this is what we had to say today. And now I see that we have some time for discussions left. I would just close the PowerPoint here. So I don't know, Alicia, if you want to moderate the discussion.
Okay, I'm coming back to you. Thank you very much, Radu and Staffan, for this interesting presentation and very touching topics. For me, it was really touching and inspiring to see how different economic and political systems, in fact, you presented, how the results, in fact, if we think about people with disabilities, are very similar or the same. I always have this kind of reflection when I compare capitalist states and communist states. In both systems, we face with the exclusion, however, also some opportunities, as you mentioned, for example, opening your own business, your own company. And we know that, for example, in communist Poland also existed such possibility. It's paradox, but I heard their stories about people with disabilities who were doing on the black market, of course. But it existed. There were people who were selling, for example, there's more artworks or some other things. It's, for me, it's a very inspiration. And maybe I will start to moderate short discussion before we listen to lecture of Marcin Stasiak. I see that Maria Buzur wants to say something, and she raised the hand. Maria, please.
Hi, and I apologize. I'm going to have to run very shortly after now because I've got another meeting. But thank you so much for the presentations. I haven't had a chance to look at the whole book. And of course, as somebody who works on Romania, I'm now stoked. I can't wait to read all the chapters. Sounds fabulous. So I have a comment question for Radu, which pertains to the frameworks that you were presenting, for the whole volume initially in terms of social versus medical kind of ways of understanding disability. The case study presented to me speaks to a different framework, a political framework, an ideological framework, right? That in effect, I mean, how I hear what you're saying is the following, and then just correct me if I'm wrong. Disabled people are basically a variation of your average proletariat, member of the proletariat. The way the regime engages with them is as with all other individuals, in the sense of thinking about them through that productivist framework, which is used for everybody. So this is not that special, and it's not so much about disability as it is about Marxist-Leninism and Ceausescu eventually in the 70s. So in that regard, how similar can we say that it is, if that's the driver, right? If the party is the decision-making kind of institution that regulates discourse, regulates access to employment, regulates salary, et cetera, how similar can we say that it is to the welfare states of Western Europe at that time?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I hope that I can answer it in 2 minutes before you have to go on to the next meeting. But yeah, this is actually something we have discussed during the symposium, how whether the social and medical models are models which can be applied to a socialist context. And the more I read about socialist countries and disability, the more I tend to, today I had an idea, let's write a paper about a third kind of model, or a fourth maybe, I don't know, which is more fitting to socialist countries. And this is, well, it's about productivism. And of course, productivism, we also have these traces in Western societies. We saw traces of this ideology in Staffan's chapter, for example. So it's not unique, but on the other hand, it's legitimated on other ideological grounds, and maybe more ideologized than in Western capitalist countries. But then to the similarities and differences between disabled people and mainstream proletarians, that there are many similarities. I mean, all these principles I've been talking about, they, as I said, they apply to all workers, irrespective of if we look at sheltered workshops or mainstream industries. But on the other hand, we also know from, well, traces, we don't have statistics, but for example, in the publications of the Blind Association, I found traces that indicate that a majority of blind people who had work, they were placed in segregated workplaces, sheltered workplaces, cooperatives. So we had, and I also interviewed deaf people, for example, in Romania, and I did not find many who were working in mainstream industries. So this is maybe the biggest difference between disabled people and average proletarians, that work was segregated throughout the communist period. I hope that this answered your question.
Thank you very much. Do you have any question? Oh, I see the raising hand of Magda. I'm giving voice to you.
Thank you. Thank you for this amazing presentation. I really cannot wait to read the book, actually. And I would like to come back to the issue that Alicia has mentioned, because it was quite striking for me, and it is quite striking for me, that when we talk about and write and research disability and work, we concentrate on this really like official policies and what state did and what state didn't do and provide and so on. But when Alicia, when you mentioned the like little artworks done by people with disabilities, what came to my mind was that, for example, deaf people did a lot of like do-it-yourself, like technological work, like repairing hearing aids that were coming from Western countries as like a charity thing, and they were people specialized in like repairing those hearing aids to make them function and sell it. The same with like flashing doorbells and telephones and stuff like this. So I wonder, what is the place of this like bottom-up, unofficial work that was done by people with disabilities, like under state socialism or in Western countries, how it matches to this like idea of like official policies that you research and write about in your book and in your in general in scholarship.
Yes, I don't know. I think the question was also related to Western societies, not only to say socialist. So do you want to start, Staffan? Do you have any idea about this bottom-up perspective on labor?
I think we have to do a number of studies concerning disability and work in history, and a lot of chapters concentrate on the social policies and so on, in relation also to different economic production systems to capture various values. And I think we have to conduct different kind of studies, and we have to reach other forms of sources in order to illuminate the bottom-up perspective in many ways.
Well, when it comes to the socialist period, well, I can only speak for the Romanian case. I did not find so much on these issues, and this doesn't mean that informal ways of work didn't exist. It's just that we don't have the sources reflecting this. But one of the traces was maybe during the early period of communism, the late 40s and 50s, and of course, if you look at the interwar period and even earlier, that begging was related. I mean, some blind people were dependent to beg, and also street vendors. They still existed during the late 1940s, but the state, as I mentioned in the beginnings, tried to discipline the society, and these kind of unofficial occupations disappeared, as far as I know. In the interviews I conducted with deaf people, the one respondent mentioned that there was a deaf beggar in front of a church, and this was during the 1970s or 80s, I suppose. So there are some indications that these kind of informal ways to earn money, of course, still existed, but we have to work more on that. Of course, it's a very relevant question.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. What still comes to my mind in this, like in this topic, is that maybe there were, from what we are talking, it seems like this like unofficial work systems were like directed into the community. At least that's my impression with deaf community, that like deaf inventors or tinkerers were providing equipment for deaf customers that were not present on the market. So maybe that's also an interesting path in this research, how this was like providing for your own community somehow. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I also can say big thank you to you, and I can't wait to read your book in real. And I'm glad that such a book appears in the market, that there is more and more scholars who write about such topics. I would like to ask other participants if you have any questions, comments. I don't see anyone. I'm also looking on chat. However, I don't see anyone writing anything on chat. I'm talking about that because I know that sometimes people write their questions on chat, and it takes some time, some moment to read it. However, I don't see anything in the chat.
I can just mention that, of course, if you have any queries and questions, you can contact me or Staffan. And there's also 20% reduced price on the book. So if you plan, because they are very expensive, these Routledge volumes, if you plan to buy it yourself, you can contact us and get a 20% off, or you could, of course, that would make us very happy to ask your library, university library, to order the book, of course. Thank you.
Yes, I think, yes. I think it would be really, really great to have it accessible at university library. Yes, this problem that books, scientific books, published in such prestigious publishing houses have a high price. It's not your fault. It's not nobody's fault, in fact, but it's just the reality. Okay, I don't see any questions and comments. I would like only make you sure that you can feel free to connect with Radu and Staffan. And I want to say big thank you to you.
Thanks.
Okay. So now I think I can stop to record.
Thank you.
So we are slowly moving to another meeting. Okay, I hope everything will be fine.